So Sakshi, welcome to you I'm from New Delhi, and Sakshi here is sitting in Cambridge. I'm very, very happy to have you here with me, and thank you very much for participating in this project to help us think of what a multi-species world could look like and what are the challenges we have there. Sakshi is a trained lawyer, but a legal researcher. She's just completed her PhD from Cambridge, and I first met her in Sydney at a multi-species justice symposium, where I heard her speak about real issues of jurisprudence, of law, of rights, environmental justice, multi-species justice, what they really mean. So today we will speak with her and learn a little more about these complicated concepts. So Sakshi, welcome.
Thank you so much.
So I just want to trigger you off saying, we keep using the word justice, but justice is a very complicated philosophical concept. And if I'm not wrong, it's also the basis of any lawmaking, of what then finally translates into rights and law. But you please correct me as you feel. But how do we think about this whole frame of rights and law and justice?
It's great that justice has not been a defined concept because it's so organic and it's out there. It's always aspirational, which is what inspires me to do this work. Because when you think of wanting to define justice, first we need to think about what are the range of injustices that we see, what we know and what we understand, and how we've been educated in thinking about what law is, what justice is. And it's a very personal political exercise as well, because at individual levels between our social economic relationship, we need to think about justice every day. But it's not necessary that we need to define it in some sort of concrete terms, because whether we define it or not define it, at the end of the day, it's about how we are going to live and how we are going to live with ourselves and other people. But at a political level, at a broader macro level, there's justice at operation of how the state engages with its citizens, how the state engages with the oppressed, how lawmakers make these laws that is affecting a range of constituency placed at different spectrum of power relations. It's important they define justice, or they aspire to a higher notion of justice than individual citizens do. But if they are not sensing there's a shift in the everyday lives, realities and demands of people, they are not going to aspire more. So it's not that at an individual level we do not have the responsibility to think about justice, but it's all right if you don't define it. But we really need to reorganize, recalibrate our relationship according to how we understand, coming down to specifics, how we understand race, gender, colonialism, going back to my home country, thinking about caste, coming down to the places where I work, thinking about Australia, Canada, and Brazil, thinking about indigeneity and settler colonialism. All of these are questions of justice, and yet they do not go and define justice, but they add to how we understand justice over decades. More importantly now, because we're thinking about climate change and climate justice, that's the word which has been held up, and none of these are legal terms, because we can still think about justice without thinking about what law is going to say about it. But the law cannot exist or operate without thinking about justice. So there is a legal notion of justice, there is a social and political understanding of justice, and there is justice as a norm, a higher norm, an aspirational norm. So it's very complex and very multi-textured terrain. It's good that we never get around to defining it, because once we are defining it, it's kind of shrugging off our responsibility, saying something has been achieved. If nothing has been achieved and the goalposts keep shifting, then there's a greater responsibility on us to address the many iterations of injustices that we have to live with and fight against.
So in a sense, is justice aspirational and also a political negotiation of some sorts? and it's constantly shifting. It can, over time,
Mm-hmm.
what might be considered uh, just 50 years back in a certain society might be revisited as society learns more, or more assertions take place, or more political ideas uh, of the power equations in society start being questioned and changed.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
it requires a big democratic act of assertions, and also the ability uh, to voice and to negotiate.
Mm-hmm.
So is the idea of democracy or of inherent in the idea of justice, or
Mm-hmm.
you can have
Yes.
justice which is not democratic at all and still be called justice.
Yes, I mean, there's also another thing about who has the power to negotiate. And there are certain communities and constituency of people, something like indigenous communities, they have been demanding justice for since the beginning of settler colonialism, and a very liberal notion of democracies as well. So they're all living within democracy, but democracy hasn't necessarily delivered on justice for them. It's
Mhm.
about how rest of them in their positions of privilege, racial, economic, political, rally to be allies to have this meaningful shift in every time. I mean, there are certain situations where it's in a very palpable sense of injustice 50 years ago as it is now, but nothing has been done about it. And that's the question of, do we need to have when and how do we give voice to these people in the sense that they can achieve tangible results and not really token signs of recognition, which is some sort of heart of my thesis as well. I work about courts and how do they recognize justice, because there's a clear separation of power. Should courts be doing a little more than they did before, or do they continue towing the lines of legislature, or do they have an extra power of delivering on justice, which we haven't thought about, and we need to, because there's an urgent situation that courts have to reframe and reformulate themselves as institutions outside of this separation of power dilemmas.
And courts come in when we have a formal structure of laws,
Mm-hmm.
I suppose, which sort of come from the negotiation, because laws are enacted in some kind of, well, in a democratic state, in the parliament or in a senate or something like that, and they are
Mm-hmm.
become kind of normative from
Right.
this abstract idea.
Mm-hmm.
And then the courts step in saying how to implement these norms.
Right.
So but as we have seen now also in India, for example, in the Supreme Court has been widely interpreting many of these norms,
Mm-hmm.
what seem to be something they've interpreted in more expanded ways also.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, courts, so the first question is that this legislation making,
Mm-hmm.
uh, is that, can we call that a formalizing of the justice structures?
Mm-hmm.
How would you term them in the justice framework?
The legislation making is a small episode in the entire narrative. So if you think about Law and Justice as an entire book, then there is this one part or one chapter. But more often than not, they really go ahead and fail people, because I mean, lawmaking and the executive operation implementation, most of it is dependent on governments and who you elect. And with that, people really don't have choices. I mean, India is a multi-party system, which is fine, but really, who's an alternative? Elsewhere, there are two parties you need to pick between, and both of them is not aspiring for anything more than having a law. So it would be a terrible mistake to think that is going to formalize justice. I mean, ideally, it should do. I mean, that's what we are taught in civic classes and law schools, but they are just enacting laws on which we can govern certain social economic relationships. So it's like applying a rule to a situation. So it's an issue resolution paradigm. It's
Mhm.
it's a tiny chapter in this entire novel we are thinking about. But if you think about justice as a narrative, then a lot of other actors come in. So the legislation is going to be a very tiny fraction of what we think constitutes justice.
And so would social movements be an important part of the other book?
Yes,
If this is a
yes.
chapter, for example, Black Lives Matter, or
Mm-hmm.
the feminist movement, or now what you're seeing, the climate justice movement, in a sense.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, most certainly, because they are going to be the huge, substantial part of the novel, because they are going to be allies, they're going to frame the political discourse, they're going to influence the judicial discourse as well. I mean, judges are going to wake up in the morning and look at what's happening around, and that's now showing effect as to how they're thinking about climate justice, because that's the easiest, and because the narrative of urgency around it. Social movements are hugely influencing how judges think. I mean, irrespective of how we imagine law as a very neutral space and judges as arbiters, they are influenced by a lot of discourses, and that influences the judicial notion of what is justice. I mean, that's important for us, right? Because at the end of the day, they're going to give us tangible results on which we can build further social movements. So yes, definitely, that's a huge chapter.
And I think it's a very important thing to realize, because it makes you constantly active, that that things can change, not set in stone. And I think for me, the message through what you're saying is that the idea of a citizenship, or being a political actor in your own, in what you think is important, is very critical to how futures are shaped. Because very often in today's world, where we become more consumers than citizens, we have tended to take a passive seat back, saying, how does it really matter, and it'll go as it goes. But you're suggesting that that's the only way in which any idea of justice gets revisited or changed, in a sense.
Of course, yes,
So you're suggesting a constant activism, in a sort, or on an activity on behalf of realization of.
Yeah.
And then this question, this word rights. What is this word rights? When we say rights, conceptually, what does that mean?
It's both positive and negative. So you have a right to lead a full life, which means there has to be some sort of economic and social enablement for you to be a full citizen. It's not, citizenship is some sort of a right because you're born here. And then as a citizen, you're entitled to healthcare and education. And there is this positive elements to which state provides and which the other people are expected to respect. But also, the other side is a negative element, that you have a right not to be harmed, you have a right not to be discriminated against, you have a right not to be killed at a fundamental level. I mean, it's, for technical purposes, there's a framework, it's always melded with each other, because if the state doesn't provide you clean drinking water, then you're obviously going to suffer and harm, a lot of harm. Then if the state is not recognizing you as a full citizen, just leaving you to token recognition, and that's giving you some right, but it's not a full right. So it's some sort of, not an entitlement, but you're entitled to a basic forms of full living, like right wages, or good health care, good social setting, good housing. There's a range of things, it keeps expanding. So a right is some sort of a power and an enfranchisement, which is very flexible, like the idea of justice. And which is why finally at some point these two rivers converge, because the more right you have within a nation state, then there is greater idea of justice as well for an individual being delivered. So definitely there's some sort of class, a privileged position that gives you the unstated rights, not just what's stated in the constitution or statutes of the legislature. And there are political ethnic minorities who definitely need more power in terms of negotiation. So there's definitely a greater idea of stated rights that need to be driven in that direction. So, and then we come to the animals. There's
Yeah.
like very, very narrow sense of this multi-species world having enfranchised. So they have a right not to be treated cruelly. But that's about limited set of rights that we have managed to recognize for them. And there's this increasing negotiation as to whether they should be treated as full citizen, or there's another level of kinship that we can establish with them, which is like, do we need to treat them like animals, or is there a position that's beyond them? So even then we talk about a very nebulous idea of right, which is
So we
mostly,
will, yeah,
yeah.
we will in the next, we will soon expand this very complex
Yeah.
of animal rights or non-human rights you bring in. But before that, I'd love to talk about, little more about rights, because we have now, rights, but, the rights are not necessarily implemented.
Yeah.
And so we have new terms, so we have like Dalit rights and Dalit movements, and or this new term, relatively new term called environmental justice, when, you know, which is little separate from the idea of social justice. So even if you mark the Chipko movement as a social movement, and because of lived ecologies, so the word environment has got evoked as a particular, to my mind, a technical kind of term. So this term environmental justice, which I know you've spoken about earlier in other places, what is the relevance of that term when we are thinking of people who that the relationship is not only a technical relationship with the non-human, or with what we call nature? So is environmental justice a useful word in that sense? And how does it get played up? Because it's got so much potency and agency now, I think.
Yes, yes. I mean, environmental justice was also conceived at the beginning as examining the relationship between the state and the private entities, right? So it wasn't born as a relationship between people and the human and the non-human. So it's a later, very recent iteration of that. But initially, environmental justice, when Robert Bullard coined it, was looking at how certain environmental acts, the environmental harms, disproportionately affect the Black people. It's the racial distribution of the southern states and in the US. And it's between 1983 and now, it's taken so much of transition and heft. It's amazing, the journey of the concept as something that can be litigated, because there are a lot of communities that have gone to court demanding that the dumping site or the pollution of river streams be taken elsewhere, because that's a question of environmental justice. And courts have come down to recognizing that something like racial or caste communities get disproportionately affected. And now we have Indigenous environmental justice, which is my PhD thesis. So
What does that mean? I mean, how is
Yeah.
it separate from environmental justice?
Yeah, so when people looked at the development of environmental justice, and it started getting recognition within state documents as well. So the Environmental Protection Authority in the US has a definition in its website, which is strange because it's done nothing about it. And then international instruments like the Carioca Declaration and the UNDRIP, all of them are talking about environmental justice. But then the indigenous people came in, and they were thinking about their relation with the state as an express question of colonialism. So when you talk about indigenous environmental justice, indigenous people and their environmentalism is a different ballgame altogether. So we think about environment as something that's distributed, something that's managed, and something that's outside. But indigenous people and their sovereignty is tied to land. So they're not distinct from environment or the more than human relationship. So animals are kin, they are totems. The land is vital to upkeep their indigeneity. So the question of indigenous environmental justice means to recognize plural sovereignty. They need their land back. They need their self-determination back. So it's not a question of whether this mining company is dumping pollution on their land. It's a question of they have been dispossessed from their ancestral land. And there's an alternate nation state and democracy built on their land. Now that needs to be undone. So there's a historic wrong that needs to be undone. And every present environmental harm is a product of the historical dispossession, genocide, and severing the relationship between indigenous people and their environment was the first thing settler colonialism did. So for instance, Australia, which I'm fond of, when they established Australia as a nation, what they did was taking over someone else's land. So at that point, that was the first environmental harm they confronted. And they're trying to remedy it even now by trying to have a constitutional voice, by having to have a power to negotiate where mining can be conducted, having control over how they govern their economic and social relationship on their land, which is a question of self-determination. So it's a tangle of rich concepts. Indigenous environmental justice is not just about harm, it's about historic wrongs.
And in somewhere in this, does the idea of the cultural relationship to land, which might be different to a non-Indigenous person's relationship to land, also come in? I mean, almost like a kind of an, if you might call it, an ontological idea of belonging differently to a place than somebody else might have, because we tend to treat land as a document of ownership, and then over time a document of memory, and it's such an important part of inheritance and everything, and also in terms of asset. So how is it differently sort of thought of when you think of indigenous environmental justice? Is it that the environmental justice term itself gets inflexed by this notion of the indigenous have a different idea of the environment than anybody might have?
Yeah, definitely. Because the word you mentioned, cultural relationships. So there is land and indigenous people have never been a proprietary relationship, but it connects to what we were talking earlier when you think about right, because all the settler colonial nations, the maximum they can do is to recognize a property relationship between indigenous people and their land. So they're not recognizing a cultural relationship. Also, all the aboriginal title, native title, they're all doing very limited things. So which is like to convert land into a property that can be owned and disposed of. And they're giving that form of right only to make sure that at a point of negotiation between mining company, the land can be easily taken away, because your property can be taken away with adequate compensation. So unless you recognize a cultural relationship with the land, and the land becomes vital for their existence. I mean, there's no way you can tell the difference between how they feel about living on this land every day from what the land feels, and how, because the land never belongs to anyone within indigenous cosmologies. The land is you. So you are the tree, you are the river, and that's where the famous slogan of water is life comes from, because it flows within the terrain and the landscape. So, and there's no way you can recognize cultural relationship through legislature. It's something that the non-Indigenous people must also understand, because it comes down to very personal understanding of what Indigenous environmental justice is, because you need to recognize that they have been oppressed, dispossessed, and subjected to genocide. So all the non-Indigenous, doesn't matter if you're white, if you're black or brown or any color, the indigenous relationship is distinct from non-indigenous people relating to land. Even if you're born on that, even if you go back to 8 generations, it's a different relationship.
And just for helping understand, how would you think of the word indigenous? Because everybody's claiming locality now, that, this is, and it's, especially in this term, in place of migrations and refugees and all debates, this idea, it becomes a narrow concept of something which is yours and of a community. And so when you use the word indigenous, it is of a particular context you're speaking of, is it?
Yeah, of course, because you see that in most of the white settler colonial nations, everyone born there claiming to be indigenous. Like in Australia, we have this fascist politician, Pauline Hanson. Her best argument is, I am indigenous because I'm born here.
Correct.
That simply, the fact of birth doesn't make one indigenous. And there's always this question of heritage. The community that you're born into, certain forms of relationship that you form as soon as you're born, and the kind of upbringing and how you relate to these dream times and song lines, and how you relate to the natural resources, natural environment. And then there is the fact of occupying that land for that longest time. I mean, the indigenous people have 60,000 years of history. Not everyone, I mean, unless you're talking about a native plant, indigenous is capital I. So it's a question of sovereignty over that land and not the mere fact of being born. So only the tribals in India can be called indigenous because there's a tribal. That's a different word as well. And I think as a normative rule, I always put indigenous people to define indigenous term, because we need to recognize both of us are non-indigenous. So we are only talking as an ally. So if you read Nick Estes and Audra Simpson, Zoe Todd, Kim Tallbear, and Elaine Morton Robinson, and these are the people you should refer to when you think about who is indigenous. These are clear indigenous authors defining what indigeneity is, and how the fact of being born is distinct from being born into a community and certain ways of living, and that makes one indigenous.
But how do one then get this into rights? Because when you talk of indigenous environmental justice, then justice has to be meted out for it to play, I guess. Otherwise just a concept. That means that they have to feel that fairness. So it has to have some kind of operation of justice. And when the cultural relationships are not well understood, or cannot be understood better than just through an observer state, not as being part of something, then how do you expand this justice framework to include these concepts which are kind of outside the way we have defined land or culture, land or relationships, or even the word which we always use as environmentalists, the commons, the global commons. I mean, even to me, appears to me, even that becomes contested. That what does that commons mean, in a sense? Because common, all the common, like the privatization of the commons is always also being operated upon as a space. It might be a different set of rules, but it's up. And you're hinting at indigenous relationships which have a different notion of space, different notions of belonging. So how do we then think of this expanded field of justice, environmental justice?
Yeah, I think that's where the decolonization move comes in, because decolonization is not just in law and theory, it's in education. And when we are at a stage when we can no longer claim we don't understand what racism is. And similarly, you cannot claim I do not understand what is this indigenous cultural relationship. At the level of schools, we are trying to decolonize education precisely because we've been trained in the school of land as property and the wide theoretical framework of how you relate to the state and how you relate to certain knowledge forms for so long. It's becoming impossible to think widely. So there's a problem of indigenous, the idea of indigenous land back, indigenous sovereignty is also part of decolonization, because once you disrupt the established, the privileged points of view, and then there is a whole new world of thinking that's available for all. It's not just for children. It's a decolonization movement is something that's evolving and that's progressing, and we need to start having these conversations, because I don't understand racism, I don't understand discrimination against indigenous people has been an excuse for a long time. Even if you don't understand this opportunity of opening your mind, you need to start thinking now, because it's never too late. The recent IPCC report and the FAO report, they've been insisting that indigenous knowledge is great for conserving biodiversity, forests, and they're the biggest tool for fighting against climate change. it's always the insistence of indigenous scholars and people that you just don't think of us when you want rescuing. So this is a way of readapting and rethinking the alternative ways of living. I mean, we need to reimagine a new world if you want to survive this planetary catastrophe and climate change. And that requires us to rearrange our social lives, economic lives, and the way we think education is, because the newer generation, it's important they understand what settler colonialism and racism is. Only then you can imagine more fuller world, and decolonization is vital. Indigenous people have been proving themselves, and they're often put on trial. I mean, it's not them who should be on trial, because to claim a property right, they need to demonstrate where they belong. Do they belong to this community? Do they have native title? Do they have rights over property? I mean, in certain forms, and most forms, settler colonialism disrupts their relations. So 200 years of colonialism, you can't expect them to have maintained the original form of social organization, economic organization. Obviously, their relationship with the land is disrupted. And when they go to courts to ask for their rights, they are asked to prove the same original relationship with the land again. So how is it even possible? I mean, we are operating within a very powerful system that asks you to prove things on your own term, on their terms, not on your terms. It isn't recognizing the past injustice. It isn't recognizing the present one.
And
so, yeah.
Sorry, we can see that in the new drives in nation states to prove that or the belonging to the nation state. I mean, India, the CEA, where
Yes.
you're trying to prove
Definitely.
that the land ownership, for example. But when these things didn't exist,
No, of
then,
course.
and this is the only world then it becomes a kind of what you said, force to prove on a terms which doesn't belong.
Yeah, of
Now, I
course.
want to introduce what you just already introduced, but maybe think of it a little wider, is this idea of the non-human. From I'll just give you my experience of working with small and marginal communities as an artist, has been that if you think of ecosystems not as eco-services, but as just as places where people coexist with their livelihoods, for example, fishers coexist with the landscape, and everything in the landscape is both culturally, but also in terms of materially, incorporated in everydayness. It's hard to separate this is culture, this is nature, or this is, it is just kind of a whole world by itself. And the non-human relationships also exist in that ecosphere. Now, so when we think of environmental justice or indigenous environmental justice, you mentioned totem poles and the multi-species. Are we moving closer to the idea of the multi-species there, or we need to do much more work for that? Because we're also talking of multi-species in the non-indigenous communities, in a sense. So you have already presented one conceptual challenge of indigenous environmental justice. Now, when you introduce this, what does it become?
Yeah, no, I mean, there's no need for it to be simple at all. It can be as complex as it is, because the smaller communities, their livestock and the fishermen have had different, it might be commercial, but it might be also a livelihood relationship with the animals they deal with on a daily basis. So right now we are only subjected to this very white vegan Western discourse of certain form of multi-species relationship. But I don't think we can think about multi-species justice without thinking about racial justice or indigenous justice. So the way we organize our lives, the non-indigenous people organize, the pastoral communities, is also vital. And there needs to be a lot of work as to how they sustain each other. So it might be they're killing animals for consumption or trading, but it's also essential for how the certain forms of smaller economies have been going on for years now. Our opposition can be for a capitalistic system of exploiting animals, the industrialized farming, which definitely must be shown the door, because it needs to end, because nobody is enjoying their life, not even people, not even humans. It's a fundamentally exploitative life-sucking exercise. So our opposition is to that, and to other forms of multi-species relationship. You need to think about, for instance, if you look at the buffalo herds pre-genocide in the US, I mean, they were not raised as livestock, but buffalo herds walked around in the stretch of prairies, and they maintained the delicate balance of ecology and human life. So they were consumed and they were lived with. So that's kind of relationship that we can aspire to, of thinking of them as equal, caring for them, and seeing how the social and the economic relations span from such relationships. So our opposition is for capitalism. So if we establish multi-species relationship on the axis of anti-capitalist, anti-colonialism, then we are getting somewhere.
But the justice frameworks, as they legally define, the way the courts operate, are very much within that framework. They're not necessarily creating any opposition to it, because I remember you commenting on the inadequacy of the various court judgments, which is one to see. There's a flurry of them, well-meaning judgments, but they don't hold any water in the legal sense. Would you like to talk about them? Because we've had, for example, in New Zealand, this right of the tribe for the river. We've had the rights of the river thing in India, in the Himalayan states, and there are multiple, and the basis of them are not always secular. Some of the judgments are actually based on religious understanding of the cosmology is very religious in a sense. But the word justice to me is a secular word in a sense, inherently. So I see a lot of contradictions here. And so what does these contradictions mean? And what is the way from these contradictions?
Yeah, I mean, because the first time you heard me speak about legal personhood, and that's not going ahead in terms of animal rights. Because if you have seen the news recently, the Colombian drug lords, hippos, which he introduced, were given personhood in American courts. But Colombia is damn angry with the Americans, because how much do you want to interfere with our lives? These hippopotamus, they are running rampage in delicate Colombian ecologies. We need to kill them. We'll deal with them as we deal with them. So somehow this legal personhood for hippopotamus has become a national sovereignty question between Colombia and the US. You will always have this. Yeah. But in New Zealand, why the right to personhood, the right of the river for to be recognized as a legal person was successful? Because they recognized indigenous guardianship of the river. So they were not thinking about it as a person who can go to court, but they recognized the Wanganui was cared for by the Maori communities, and there's the riverine communities, and for their existence it is essential we recognize this river as a person. So it's a question of guardianship which is recognized, which makes New Zealand so distinct from Indian cases where it's essential for Hindus. So what about the other communities which exist? I mean, what if they want to go to the court to sue on behalf of river of Yamuna and Ganga? It also depends on individual judges, how they think about what religion mythology is. It's always going to be uncertain who's going to care for it, which is why we keep insisting on the indigenous people should take the guardianship of land and river. It becomes more meaningful. And just last week, we found out that Peruvian courts, indigenous women have gone to court suing under right to nature to protect the river being damaged by being dumped, the mining and tailing dam refuse on the river. So now there's some very interesting development in the Latin American nations, where earlier right to nature was only a paper tiger. So they only recognized right to nature and the constitution did nothing about it. But right now, indigenous people are using it to go to court to ask for the guardianship. And we'll see how it evolves now, because it's still a resource that's being cared for. You cannot go to court on individual animals. So I don't see how this animal legal personhood is going to go any further without suddenly turning into a very white colonial discourse about animal relationship. So yeah,
And
that's what.
this, you know, this the right to nature being recognized in some of the South American countries, I think, is it, and in some countries, not in others, is it
Hmm.
because of the histories and
Yeah,
the kind of populations they have and
yeah,
how
yeah.
dominant the cultures are there?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of what argument did you use? Did you use guardianship argument to go? Were you facing any imminent challenge in terms of climate justice? And see, for instance, when Bolivia made its petitions in the earlier COP delegation asking for climate reparations and climate justice, it's that moment when they recognize the Pachamama, the Mother Earth, and the right to nature discourse as well. So it's a
Right.
kind of that precise political movement which shapes, and if you get that, if you enter that gate, and then you have all the space to engage and expand your discourse.
Yeah, and there is a actually, though we talk of the Anthropocene, and there's so much
Mhm.
being talked about and there are more books about the Anthropocene now than there were
Yeah.
in the
Mhm.
last 100 years, maybe.
Mhm.
But even in the climate justice and the COP discussions, on the other environmental discussions around the
Mhm.
world, there's a great idea of the nature being anthropomorphized. You know, it's like
Mhm.
the gaze is always from the human.
Yeah.
So even in the climate discussions, it's about the human species. Nobody's talking about what's happened to the other species. We're
Mhm.
talking we will not survive in a sense.
Yeah.
So of course that is kind of understandable, but the complete blind spot to every other living being, every
Mhm.
other planetary existence,
Mhm.
uh, it shows that, I mean, is it that we are far, far away from even recognizing any of this, except
Mhm.
in conversations like what we are having,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
in the academia and in some forums?
Mhm.
How far is it from a real sense of?
Yeah.
Is it
I
taught in
mean,
the law school, for example? This idea.
yeah, it's unlikely. I mean, universities are still very secluded spaces, right? We can
Mhm.
have very meaningful discourses between academics.
Mhm.
But if you look at COP26 now, it's so disappointing that they're not even recognizing what's elementary. I mean, they're not even recognizing what's threatening them because they just don't care. Because we're still at imagining a world where the rich will survive invariably. So
Mhm.
if the politicians are not shifting discourse, I don't know how to gauge what common people are thinking, but there seems to be a lot of anguish around for their future. And I mean, at some level, they do see without the woodlands and the forests and the animals, they're not going to have a future. And when
Mhm.
they worry for their children, especially in the context of bushfires, the death of animals was particularly a sore point, and it's relived and reimagined over and over again in the Australian and the Californian bushfires. But with the politicians, it's still, because when you talk about colonialism and capitalism, they still need to keep it up for them to retain the power. And
Mhm.
which of them? I mean, the Britain and the US and France, all the Western European nations had their power. Are they willing to pay the reparations for the global South? None of that has been addressed. So they're not going to do anything unless
Mhm.
you turn up the heat through social movements, which is
Mhm.
why we keep going back to social movements on people being restless and actively voting people out of power or demanding what they want now. I mean, if we bring in more discourse around multi-species living and indigenous sovereignty in common movements, because it's not about marching on Fridays for our future when all the faces are just white. Like, are we marching for a white future, or what is it? Unless it was threatening your future, would you not have spoken up? We need to have, which is why again we go back to decolonization.
Mhm.
It's like you need to think bigger. Obviously your life is not just your life, it's built on, the Western world is built on global plunder from the global South, and the global South has been at the receiving end of imperialism and extractivism. So they're tied to an economic system where they cannot extricate themselves out. So India has to keep manufacturing coal, and the Nigerian economies are opening up because they're resource rich. This is a system which is built against us. So we need to fight against the system to
Mhm.
demand justice.
Yeah, and it becomes a uphill task because you're not just fighting one thing, you are trying to change
Or yeah,
a lot of things. And as you said, even the idea of indigeneity does not really figure in these discussions.
no,
And because the nation state is the frame, and nation states are already on the same path because that's the only model they know of.
yeah,
So, this dominant path of what to do next, and that's the only way. When you think of the poor or when you think of poverty, there's only one way of thinking about it in terms of
yeah.
what that thing is. But there is how do you think of uh, uh, conceptually uh, uh, well, a different world in a sense, non-human and human, with
Mm-hmm.
some, because is it, would you say that the word agency is a very important part of any legal discourse? Would you
Mm-hmm.
use that, or would you use something else?
I mean, yes, it's also a very academic word, right? Agency, only academic understand, or someone who's keyed into what the word agency
Yeah,
is. But we be thinking of more common like a community.
right,
Everything is a community. So if you think about belongingness to a larger stretch of land, larger collective of people, than that is narrowly defined on race or economic power, then we are forming our communities and recognizing those communities, and these communities need to keep expanding unless we get a sense of the, I mean, and unless we recognize how power is unequally distributed between these. So now, right now, it's just the Western world and the imperial subject. So this actor and the subject relationship is really detrimental to idea of justice. I think we need to have more communities and inclusive communities. I mean, only then you can imagine the multi-species justice and the multi-species world, because how do you relate to something other than your pet, something other than something that's not
right.
domesticated? How do you relate yourself to an industrialized violated animal? I mean, you need to expand the imagination to live in an alternative world. I mean, it can't be defined because everyone's idea of alternative worlds is going to be different. But that's what we are thinking of when we talk about people's Green New Deal and things like that. So,
Yeah.
how do we involve people in this?
And I want to briefly touch on this idea of, countries like India, which they call countries in transition,
Mm-hmm.
in some ways, where when you look at community life, for example, communities living in landscapes and being kind of part of interacting with nature as a daily thing, then eh, there are many cultures which are not, of course there's a cultural transition also going on there, but
Mm-hmm.
they still have relationships and words and rituals which show a different relationship
Mm-hmm.
to the ecosystem and to the world around them.
Yeah.
And so it's one doesn't have to always go to isolated communities in forests, or to
No.
look at, uh, maybe it's, so the question, what I'm curious about is, you of course come from
Mm-hmm.
India, uh,
Mm-hmm.
and understand the cultural underpinnings
Mm-hmm.
here, and now you are studying in the West, so you've also had a chance to observe, uh, as a scholar, different ways of being, in a sense,
Mm-hmm.
almost. And how do you see this gap? Because it seems to me, as a visitor to the West,
Mm-hmm.
that this is it is lost.
Mm-hmm.
This culture in transition is lost.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know where to look for it. You don't know where the resources are. Many
Mm-hmm.
cultural resources are still here. They are
Mm-hmm.
still existing in everyday communities, in a sense. Uh,
Yeah.
of course, they're sometimes politically activated for the wrong reasons, but they
Mm-hmm.
still exist. I mean, for example, the Niyamgiri struggle, where against Vedanta, where this indigenous community fought to stop, and I think the Supreme Court gave a judgment on cultural lines,
Yeah. Yeah.
that cultural rights, and I think that was a kind of first.
Mm-hmm.
So, so first, your reaction to this idea of a cultural person who's a person of two worlds now,
Mm-hmm.
because you
Yeah.
you understand both. Yeah.
Yeah.
And how does it? What do you feel about that? What you reflect on? What you see? Use the word colonization
Mm-hmm.
as a very critical thing of decolonizing something. How do you see this colonial underpinnings on where you are right now? Because I think
Mm-hmm.
there's implications on your political agency, which you have a
Mm-hmm.
lot of, to
Mm-hmm.
see this through.
Yeah.
What you've
Yeah.
said, the journey you've set yourself out on.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the West is facing a lot of anguish when you remind them to confront their colonial past and present. I mean, which is why the all the quarrels with critical race theory, and here especially the Tory governments trying to root out any discussion around racism in the school textbook, saying, "Oh no, we are British, we are great, we have always been great, we are
I think there was
bringing
a
in."
report which came out saying there's no racism in some
Yes,
part.
of
Yeah,
course, which is
yeah,
written by Tory conference,
yeah.
they're Tory academics, which is great. I mean, they're so keen on absolving themselves. They refuse. I mean, and building an image of homogeneous nation. They refuse to see the reality that this is a nation of migrants and diverse races. So if you're Black person and you've been born here and living for 3 generations, you're still not British, because the idea of British is white. You just contrasted with the sheer diversity in the nations of global south, which is often taken and manipulated. And the idea of decolonization in India is terribly being appropriated by the Modi and the RSS and the
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 right
right,
wing.
the fascist right of. I mean, it's a loss, because our diversity is, and the cultural diffusion is across religions. So the Hindus and the Muslims, and they learn. I mean, none of this. The idea of purity is such a terrible and
Yeah,
harrowing notion. There is no purity.
it's a caste
Culture.
idea, isn't it? It's upper
It
caste
is,
idea.
yes. It
Yeah,
started with the caste, and
yeah.
then it's being melded into religion.
Mm,
There's nothing purely Hindu or purely any majority religion about anywhere. So, I
mm.
mean, the notion of the pure British white person is very much like the pure right. And you need to respect these diversities and try and understand as much as you can in your lifetime, because there's a lot of work that need to do in terms of learning. And even if you're born and I've lived there for a little less than 25 years of my life. And this, it's just the volume of things that we can learn and take in and reimagine our lives around that mesmerizes. I'm
Mm,
not an expert on anything, but
mm.
it's the fact that it is so rich and diverse, and there's so many ways of living well and living with people. That's fascinating. And you can see that micro practices here as well. People are still trying to fight against this very racist notion of white Britain, homogeneous nation. And the charm is in how we live every day and how we fight against this.
Correct. Right.
A fight is also part of our culture, right? How we have resisted fascist forces every now
Right.
and then. So,
Right. And this thing about cultural rights, I briefly mentioned the Supreme Court judgment on Yamgiri. And
mhm.
sometimes, one of the critiques, and I also sometimes think about it as just an observer, that this is a slippery slope, isn't it? Because it can be
Mhm.
appropriated in any direction you want. When you
Yeah.
bring cultural rights in, I mean, you can have the extreme right asserting cultural rights over something, and then
Yeah, you
so
see that, yeah, already being appropriated by decolonization, but that is not the cultural right we're talking about.
yeah,
So it's because Niyamgiri was brought by tribal people, and
yeah,
by saving that mountain pristine as it is, you've just saved the lives of all the people, not just tribal people in Orissa. That the mining company was kicked out, and one great work is by the Norwegian author Marcus Kroger, Iron
mm,
Wolf. He has documented India's resistance to mining. So he also partly looks at Niyamgiri and
mhm,
other resistance to mining. So it was foregrounded by indigenous people, but they had allies who, like other people, who saw their point in fighting with this concept of cultural rights to resources and mountains, was also saving the environment. I
mhm,
mean, it's not just a mythological, religious, cultural right when you think about, because in India we've thought about culture as closely associated with the religion, but elsewhere that's convenient here and in Australia. When you think about cultural rights, you're talking about sovereignty and self-determination. So
Right.
it's distinct from any religious connotations.
So, what are you next going to be researching?
I'm continuing my research in climate justice, indigenous environmental justice, but I'm also looking at politics of expertise. So there's a lot of
Ah,
alternatives being pushed around the green renewables, but it's also somehow displacing indigenous people. It's also being very colonial. So part of that would be that. And then I'm also looking at how to reconcile the idea of plural sovereignties, because once you mention sovereignty, it's imagined as conflicting with state sovereignty, and it doesn't have to be that. But
right.
how do you reconcile that within jurisprudence? So it's a very specific and broad.
So you are actually resisting many dominances at the same time,
Yes.
pedagogical as well as
Yeah.
cultural and political.
Yeah. I
And
mean, as people of color, you invariably get drawn into it. You can't help it.
no, but all people of color don't necessarily get drawn into the space you are. So obviously, you have a big personal drive for that.
Yeah.
Big sense
Yeah.
of what you think is right and what you think is just,
Yeah.
in a
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah. It's a
Uh,
very anti-capitalist, anti-colonial goal, future ahead.
well, it's such a pleasure to see that, and it's such a pleasure to see your energy in
Yes.
this. And I can only look forward to seeing you fulfill and possibly reading about what you do and start of a
Definitely.
new journey, I think, now next.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's really absolutely delightful to speak with you, Sakshi.
Yeah.
Thank
Thank you
you
so
very
much for this conversation.
Thank you,
It was great.
Sakshi.
Thank you.
Bye bye.